welcome to the election show on MNN, the Manhattan Neighborhood Network. I'm your host, Dr. Christina Greer. I'm an associate professor of political science at Fordham University and the politics editor at The Grio. I'm joined today via Skype with Matt McDermott, who is a communication strategist and vice president at Whitman Insight Strategies, and also political analyst and professor of political science at Columbia University with Dr. Lincoln Mitchell. Thank you all for joining me.
Good to be virtually here with you.
Virtually, we'll make this happen. So the coronavirus pandemic has many of us practicing social distancing. As you can see, we're all at home, but the presidential campaigns and politics are marching on, or are they? So I just want to jump into it. Let's get there. So we're in some unprecedented times. We're in a public health crisis. Bernie Sanders and Joe Biden they debated last weekend. Joe Biden won Florida, Illinois, and Arizona when they had their primaries on Tuesday. What do you all think of the primary results and the last debate? And then we'll sort of talk about where we go from there. So, Matt, start us off. What did you think of the debate and then the results where Joe Biden swept Illinois, Arizona, and Florida, pretty diverse states?
I mean, to put this simply, Joe Biden is the presumptive Democratic nominee at this point. He had resounding victories in, as you mentioned, Florida, Illinois, Arizona, very demographically different, very much different in terms of the implications of each of those states on the November election. And he won all three overwhelmingly, winning both white voters, African-American voters, and even Latino voters in Arizona. And so I think he's been able to build the coalition any candidate would have needed to win this primary. And you see that now both in the popular vote lead that Joe Biden has and the delegate lead. Joe Biden sits in a position right now that, frankly, Bernie Sanders can't overcome. And so I think it's more of a question of if, not when, Bernie Sanders decides to leave this race. I think both because of the electoral impossibility he has at getting the nomination and frankly, the health crisis we're facing right now. It's obvious at this point that neither campaign is going to be able to run a typical primary campaign that they would have if not for this crisis. And so if you're not able to get out there and talk to voters in the traditional sense, it really begs the question of why this primary election is continuing given the current situation.
Lincoln, what do you think?
Well, you mentioned Florida, Illinois, and Arizona. I would also add that the only reason Joe Biden didn't win Ohio is because they didn't have the election there, but he would have won that too. 10 days ago, right after, 10 days ago, for Bernie Sanders staying in this race, it was an act of, on the one hand, hubris, and on the other hand, perhaps an effort to move the party leftward. Now for Bernie Sanders to stay in the race, it is putting people at risk. To go and vote is a health risk, and it is straining resources at the state level where they don't have those resources. Joe Biden, whether we like it or not, is the nominee. We should recognize that. Bernie Sanders should recognize that for the good and safety and health of the American people, he needs to get out of the race. And we should begin to focus on what I think is an extremely important issue of not only how do we conduct this election in what could be still some segment of the coronavirus crisis still going on, but how do we prevent Republicans from using this as an opportunity to strengthen efforts to suppress the vote under the guise of adapting to the coronavirus. That's a tremendous concern for me, and that's much more important than whether Bernie loses by 20 points or 40 points in the next state.
Matt, I see you shaking your head. Do you agree?
100%. I mean, look, this country at the moment is facing a crisis that we have never faced before, both in terms of public health and the economy. And I think it's going to take a collective effort of all of us, not only to right this ship, but do so in a way that allows us to, both correct the public health crisis, correct the economic crisis, and then focus on the November election. I don't see at this point what other ideological debate needs to be had in the Democratic primary at this point. I think we've had quite a lengthy debate over the last year and a half in terms of policies, in terms of politics for each of the candidates. It's obvious at this point that Joe Biden is the Democratic nominee. And so I think what we should be doing moving forward is really getting an understanding from that presumptive nominee in Joe Biden as to what he would be doing differently in this current environment, given, I think, the obvious failures that have been taking place in the federal government under the Trump administration, and really getting a clear conversation going in terms of what's happening today under the Trump administration and what would be different if we had new leadership in Washington.
Right. I mean, we're seeing Republican congressmen who have clearly been cashing out on the coronavirus. But for both of you, what do you say to Democratic voters, Bernie supporters in particular, who want this competition of free and fair elections? And so even though we've had, percentage of Americans in certain states going to the polls, what do you say to those Democratic voters who support Bernie, who have yet to go to the polls, who say, I actually want it on record that I'm supporting Bernie, I'm not supporting Joe Biden? We've seen quite a few of the primaries move back to June, hoping that by then we'll be in some sort of non-social distancing where we are today. Matt, what do you think of those voters? I mean, there's something to be said about free and fair elections and competitive elections, and that's kind of the argument that they're making, so that we don't cancel the remaining Democratic primaries.
And look, that's absolutely valid. I mean, I think every voter in this country deserves the right to vote in a primary if he or she wants to, and they'll still have that opportunity. The primaries will still take place. It's just a question of viability at this point, and whether Bernie Sanders is in this race or not, any voter still has the chance and goes to the polls and vote for Bernie Sanders on the ballot, but he has no viable path to the nomination. On the flip side, I think we need to have more of a conversation in our party about what it means to unite behind a singular force to take on this administration. And I don't think we could have more of a clear reason to do so after the last few weeks. I mean, we've seen firsthand the inability of this Republican administration to do anything to protect the health and welfare of this country, to frankly do anything as of yet to rebound the economy from the collapse it's had over the past 2 weeks. And so I think we as Democrats really need to stand as a united force moving forward and make a clear and compelling case as to why these failures happened under this Republican administration and why we need to elect Democrats come November to fix this mess at the moment.
Mm-hmm. Lincoln, what do you think?
Well, a couple of things. I don't think we should call upon states to cancel primaries, right? We haven't voted in New York State. Our primary here is scheduled for late April. I think it would be terrible and wrong if Andrew Cuomo announced tomorrow, which he can't really legally, that, we're not going to have the primary. What I'm suggesting is that a mature, serious person who wants to be president of the United States, but like many of us is never going to be president of the United States, come to grips with that reality and make a grown-up statement to his supporters at this time of a crisis. But there's another side of this too. Another thing I would say to Bernie Sanders supporters, and frankly to Andrew Yang supporters, is that you have won the day. What serious people are now talking about in Washington is right out of Bernie Sanders and Andrew Yang's portfolio of ideas. So including some kind of a UBI, universal basic income, the reality that rationing out health care in a time of a pandemic is a terrible policy that endangers all of us, no matter how good your healthcare program is. So Bernie Sanders' ideas are winning. Bernie Sanders is not, and he needs to address that. The other thing I would say is that, I think Matt spelled out the kind of framework for going forward, the importance, in my view, of electing, in this case, Joe Biden over Donald Trump, but I think it's much more dire than that, and we have to wrestle with that. We have used this term cult to describe Donald Trump. But what we saw until very recently was one, the strength of the cult, the resilience of that cult, but also it turning into a death cult, where people in the media, because of their fealty to their cult leader, were lying to the American people and putting them in harm's way. That is the leadership we have had from Washington until very recently. And if we don't change that in November, this is going to get much, much worse. We have seen how little this cult cares about human life. And I know that sounds a little bit out there, but let's look at what we saw on Fox News when time was being wasted because Donald Trump didn't want to face the reality of what the coronavirus was.
Right. And so moving forward, what message do you all think that the Democrats should have? I mean, as of now, we haven't seen a cohesive message from them, per usual. What should Tom Perez and Nancy Pelosi and Chuck Schumer and even Bernie Sanders and Joe Biden be saying and doing collectively right now, because we are faced with a pandemic? We are in a recession. We're not rolling into a recession. We're already in one when you have people who aren't going back to work for a few weeks, few months, or ever. So Lincoln, I'll start with you. What should be the collective response of the Democratic Party right now?
Over the last roughly century, not too many people, when they're actually seeking re-election, have lost, right? Leaving Gerald Ford aside in 76 because he was there for a very short period of time because of Richard Nixon's resignation. We're talking about George H.W. Bush, who lost to Clinton in 1992, Carter, who lost to Reagan in 1980, and then you have to go back to Herbert Hoover, who lost to FDR in 1932, to Franklin Roosevelt. And the theme there is that the message, and this is not something that we hear a lot because it's counterintuitive, but the message is that what we're doing now isn't working. The default setting for many Americans, for better or for worse, is give them 8 years, give them a chance. And if you want to beat that, you have to come in with they are failing. Now, a political guy I spoke to in California, actually in San Francisco, which is, in a kind of worse off in this crisis right now than we are, his view, and he's a partisan guy, but his view is Donald Trump right now is going to have to run on death and depression. And if the other guy's running on death and depression, the nuance of your platform matters less. Having said that, Joe Biden is poised to run on maturity, sanity, some form of normalcy, which I think is overplayed because I don't think we can go back to that normalcy. And from a policy angle, this libertarian nonsense, which has poisoned our politics, and in some cases poisoned Joe Biden's politics, isn't working. Let us recognize that if the United States wants to function like every other affluent country in the world, we cannot live in some Ayn Rand fantasy. And you're going to have to present that in language that ordinary voters not everyone has had the displeasure of reading Ayn Rand, can understand, but that has to be the theme here. And the economic crisis and the health crisis make that even more apparent.
Matt, I mean, you're a strategist. What do you think moving forward?
Yeah, I think I'm more focused, frankly, for the societal benefit on the immediacy right now. And I think we're being hampered right now by a delay in data and not realizing the gravity of this situation and the need for immediate action. I mean, we're sitting right now in an American economy where best estimates say that 5 million or more people have lost their jobs in the last 7 days. We have never in history seen a crisis the size and the scale and the scope of this. And I don't think any of us are quite ready for that reality. And what we're seeing out of Congress right now, including from the Democrats, is frankly not a match for the issue at hand. I think the latest legislative agenda is maybe $1 trillion, $1.5 trillion. That includes some sort of immediate check that goes out to Americans. We should be talking in the magnitude of 2, 3, 4, 5 times that. I think Bernie Sanders, to his credit, is pushing the conversation in that regard, in part because I think Democrats need to stand up and start raising the alarm bells for what's happening in this country beyond the public health crisis. We have millions of Americans who have lost their jobs in the last 7 days across sectors of this economy that aren't going to be able to rebound if we're all stuck in our houses for the next few months. And something needs to be done immediately for those people. And so if as Democrats, we can't stand up and start making an argument as to how we need to save not only this economy, but the livelihood of our people in a public health crisis, then I don't know what we're doing to deserve to run an election in November. I mean, I think we need to focus on the now. Democrats in Congress really need to come together and decide what sort of policy agenda they want to put forth, because otherwise we're looking at a situation where millions of Americans don't have a job and our hospitals are quite literally overwhelmed in the next 10 days. And it just doesn't seem like any party in Washington right now is speaking with the urgency to actually get something done.
Right. Well, it seems like, the large conversation is bailing out cruise ships and airports or airline industry, and that doesn't trickle down to Americans who are in the service sector for sure. So going back to thinking about Democratic strategies and how we should be voting, I mean, Lincoln, as you mentioned, New Yorkers aren't going to the polls until April. Let's just say we have the scenario that Matt has laid out for us, where we are in our homes, social distancing, for quite some time. Obviously lots of cultural institutions put a 2-week marker on it. Now they're readjusting and saying maybe it's more of a month or 2 months that they'll be shut down. So let's just assume that by late April, we're still in our homes, possibly in a shelter-in-place situation, which many of us should already be doing. Do we think that we should move to paper ballots? Will that be enough for New Yorkers? What do you think some of the strategies should be as an analyst?
I've been kind of thinking about this and trying to write about this, and I want to just say that your framework there that we are still sheltering in place or something like it in late April is very realistic, and we need to recognize this. That's not something implausible. That's very plausible right now. I think what we have to do is move towards, on the one hand, just from a kind of structural perspective on the voting, a comprehensive vote-by-mail program. But we have to do that in a way that makes it easy and possible for everyone to vote. And there are a lot of difficulties there. For example, not everyone trusts the mail, right? Not everyone has a fixed address. One thing that you could do, for example, I'm not suggesting this, if you wanted to make it harder for students or homeless people to vote. Homeless people do have the right to vote, as we know, is you could say you can't register with the P.O. box, because many college students have P.O. boxes still that they use, right? So, and you have to raise awareness of this. So it has to be a comprehensive effort. Now, the good thing about here in New York is that we have the April 28th primary, maybe it's the 27th, I don't know offhand, which is only a presidential. And there's not much to get right or wrong there since we already have a nominee. But then we have a June primary for all these other offices, a state assembly, House races if they're competitive. That, in my book, could be easily postponed to September without that big of a deal. We've had that situation in the past. But we have to have it right by then, and then going into November. The key here is, on the one hand, in the states where the government, the governor and state legislature, are making a good faith effort, we have to do this in a way that is inclusive. And then we have to be aware that there will be voter suppression efforts. But we also have to be aware that in close states where there is vote by mail going into November, the Republicans, if Trump loses those states, will say it was fraud, and he will use that as fodder not to leave office. And we have seen just how loyal his people in the media and his supporters are to him, and they will believe that. And that, to me, remains an existential threat because of all the reasons Matt laid out of what the danger of another continued Trump presidency, particularly one that is viewed as illegitimate, would be.
Right. Matt, your thoughts?
Yeah, I very much agree with Lincoln. I don't think we can get into the practice of delaying our democracy for any crisis. I think our vote is too important, and so the end state of that quite obviously needs to be a mail-in ballot program in every state in this country, because I think we all agree that the public health crisis is such that we can't have anyone, let alone senior citizens, 60, 70, 80-year-old voters going out to precincts and standing in hour-long lines in a health crisis like this. So I think we need a mail ballot program. It looks like most states are moving towards that. But I think we need to think beyond the primary. I think we need to start as both a state in New York and nationally thinking about the implications of that for a November election, because it doesn't seem apparent to me at the moment that we're going to be in a position later this year where we're going to be back to normal and everyone's going to be able to vote in the same way that they're used to. So I think contingencies need to start being implemented, not only for the primary, but for the November election as well.
Right, and we have to also think about our conventions. So the state of Wisconsin has been planning for well over a year, to have the convention in Milwaukee. What do you all think will become of that? I mean, we don't know, as we've said, where we'll be as far as social distancing and the coronavirus in July, but let's just say we're emerging from, if we're looking at the patterns of Italy, and we can sort of say California is, closer in line on the timeline to Italy, and New York is just buckling in for the roller coaster, unfortunately. Let's just say we're prepared in Wisconsin in July for a Democratic primary. What do you all think that even looks like, Matt?
Yeah, I think this is a brave new world for all campaigns. I mean, you see this up and down the ballot, campaigns which have always been used to talking to voters firsthand in real time in person, having an inability to do that. And I think that will continue for the foreseeable future. So I think not only the implications for the convention, but even the campaigns from the presidential race on down to local city council races need to start wrapping their heads around how they're going to be able to communicate to voters, not only in this environment where they can't physically talk to people, but in this environment where the news is overwhelmed by this national emergency. How do you craft a message that's able to break through in an environment like that? That is a hard question we need to think about.
Right. Someone's phone is ringing. And so I think that that's really important, especially when we think about we already have 2 confirmed cases of coronavirus of sitting New York City council members. And so it's bringing it home, but we also remember that, there's still a digital divide, and quite a few New Yorkers don't have high-speed internet or laptops. And so how we communicate with our constituents is of great importance. Lincoln, what do you think?
I would be I have friends who are delegates. I will be delegates. I don't really talk to this. I'm sure you do too. But I would be very hesitant to go to the convention if we're only 2 weeks out of this, for example. So you got to be free and clear for a while. Mm-hmm. My sense is that I know this would be an economic blow to the city of Milwaukee, the state of Wisconsin, wherever the Republican primary is going to be. But the better part of valor here would be to cancel the conventions and do it virtually. And if you cancel them in 2020, we will never have them again, because the conventions have been shortened in recent years. There was one year where, because of the hurricane, it was further shortened. These are from another era, and they're fun if you're kind of there and seeing old friends, but they don't play a useful role in our politics. So this might be the end of political conventions. As far as the campaigns, this changes everything about campaigns. The good news is, if you're doing phone banking, people are home with a lot of time to talk now, a lot of them. But it changes everything about so much of our lives, right? I mean, we talked about the unemployment rate, but there are also people whose hours have been cut, who are now underemployed to the point where they can't pay their rent, right? And that's a harder number to measure, but there are millions of those, and there will be millions more. Our politics is very much about in person, right? I mean, there was one point earlier this week where the Republican senators were going to discuss something together. They shouldn't be discussing anything together. These are all these people. Mitch McConnell's 133. Some of these people are well into their 70s, and they shouldn't be getting together. So this really forces us to rethink everything, and we, as a country, are terrible at rethinking anything.
Right. Well, I mean, I've definitely thought about, the coronavirus definitely seems to have no discrimination against geographic boundaries, race, obviously age even. We thought that it targeted just the old, but if you look at the numbers of people in hospitals, definitely older people die more frequently from coronavirus, but it definitely targets, millennials and Generation Xers and even young people. But sort of shifting gears just a little bit, and thinking about sort of our 2 Democratic candidates who are still there. Last time we were together, which seems like forever ago, when we were able to touch and chit-chat and give hugs, we talked about the vice presidential nomination and how important that would be, because Bernie Sanders is 78 and a half years old and has had a massive heart attack, because Joe Biden is 77 years old and doesn't seem as sharp as he was in 2008 when he was campaigning with Barack Obama, and the importance of choosing someone either demographically important, so either a woman or person of color, a black woman, a black person, a Latinx person, or do you choose someone ideologically to sort of satisfy the Bernie faction, someone maybe like Elizabeth Warren, to sort of get the progressives on board. Because of the coronavirus crisis and what's happened in the past week, do you all have any different thoughts about who Joe Biden should choose as a vice presidential running mate? Matt, I'll start with you, just because a lot has changed since we were last together.
A lot has changed, and the most important thing has changed is Joe Biden went on a national debate stage and announced the demographic of his nominee. So unless something changes, the vice presidential nominee for Democrats will be a woman under Joe Biden. So I think that obviously narrows the conversation set. And I think the question then is, what does he need out of a vice president? I think it's increasingly clear at this point that this election will be fought during not only a recession, but a huge job crisis for this country. If we have millions of people who are currently unemployed, who, unless the economy shoots up come summer and fall of this year, will be looking for work in a very different economy. I think that suggests that we need not only a president, but a vice president who very much has the chops to deal with the economic crisis that we're facing, and have plans that can immediately be put in place to rectify the situation. I think, just based on where we are today, that would lend credence to a candidacy like Elizabeth Warren, who has spent the last year and a half putting together an economic agenda that can work for lower and middle class Americans, And I think now more than ever, Democrats need to stand up and make a very clear message as to what their policy agenda would be given the recession we're facing and given the unimaginable job crisis we're facing as a country right now that doesn't seem like it's going to be able to rebound before the November election.
I mean, they're already saying that roughly 75% of restaurants may never reopen, and roughly 1/3 of cultural institutions, meaning museums, may never reopen as well. I think it's interesting that you bring up Elizabeth Warren because she satisfies the demographics and the ideological sort of distinctions that I think a lot of voters are looking for. Lincoln, what do you think?
Well, last time we were together, I said Warren, but now I'm having a little bit second thoughts only because Massachusetts has a Republican governor. And that means, at least for the first year of the Biden presidency, you may have a Republican senator replacing Warren. Now, Biden could address that by sitting down with Governor Baker and saying, let's talk this through. Mm-hmm. I'm struck by Biden's, first of all, Biden cannot go back on this pledge. That would be a huge mistake. Mm-hmm. Walter Mondale made a similar pledge in 1984. But remember, when Mondale made that pledge, everyone knew Reagan was going to get reelected anyway. And then very quickly he looked around, and there were not as many. There were no women senators at that time and no women governors. He had fewer to choose from. I think that right now the important thing for Biden is I would make this choice sooner rather than later, but I would also link it to other choices. If Biden picks, Kamala Harris, Val Demings, Elizabeth Warren, any of these people, there's going to be some people who like it, some people who don't. What will hurt Biden is if he doesn't put to rest rumors that he's going to put people like Jamie Dimon and Michael Bloomberg into his cabinet. Right. So I think name a few people, make it clear what kind of presidency this is going to be, do it soon so you seem more presidential during a crisis.
Right. Well, that's all the time we have today. Thank you all so much for being with me, Matt and Lincoln. I'm Dr. Christina Greer. You have been watching The Election Show on MNN.